brain. So this is how we gain information about the external world. We call them ascending systems because they actually come up in the brain or come from the eye or from the ear or from our body. So we call these the ascending systems. In order for us to have a conscious appreciation of anything, we have to have the information ultimately get to cortex. Motor areas are going to be part of the descending system of the brain. So motor behavior is going to be initiated in the cortex, and now those systems are going to go down to affect behavior in the body. So here we want to talk about how action occurs as the result of activation of particular cortical areas. And there will be different cortical areas that are going to be involved in the planning and initiation of movement. We call that the pyramidal system. And there will be other parts of the brain called the extrapyramidal system that are going to be intimately involved in making sure that motor behavior is normal. Now, when sensory information comes into the brain, it leads to internal processes. And some of these internal processes result in thought. And so that isn't necessarily movement. What we want to focus on is when that incoming sensory information actually leads to a movement. And here we're going to focus specifically on the movement of the body below the neck again, because the movement of the face is very, very complicated. We smile. Other animals don't smile like we do. And so that makes the musculature and the control of it very, very complicated. So we're going to focus here on the movement of parts of the body below the neck. So the motor system is generally divided into a number of subsystems. So we have our pyramidal system, and these are called the direct and indirect cortical spinal systems. We'll be talking about that in a minute. The extrapyramidal motor system, which is composed of basal ganglia nuclei and other nuclei that will be very important later when we have a discussion about clinical disorders. And lastly, the cerebellum. Now, this division into these motor areas has some heuristic value, but it's very important to appreciate that for the slightest movement, for any normal movement, no matter how small that movement is, all of these systems have to work together. And so they're really all complexly interrelated. And so if you take out any part of the entire system, it changes the ability to make a normal movement. Now, we've already discussed the pyramidal system, but I wanted to add a few more details and to make sure that it's very well understood. The pyramidal pathway is involved in the initiation of a motor movement. So it's the cortex initiates movement, and so this pyramidal pathway is the major pathway that is involved in that process. It's called pyramidal because the neurons in area 4, if you remember, that give rise to the cortical spinal pathway are shaped like little pyramids. And so that's where it got its original name, as pyramidal. Now, the pyramidal neurons are going to give rise to the corticospinal pathway. And the cortical spinal pathway, you've seen this picture many times. Here's our little pyramidal neurons up in motor cortex, and here's the axon coming down, crossing in the medulla, entering the spinal cord, and synapsing onto our anterior horn cells, which are actually in the spinal cord. And the important thing here is that these neurons, the anterior horn cells, are the only neurons that actually go out and innervate the muscle. And we'll see later that there are different clinical signs and symptoms that occur if you damage these neurons versus these neurons. But where is motor movement actually planned? Well, it turns out, if I were to turn the model here again, and this is the front of the brain, this is the back, this is area 4 right here, the planning of motor movement occurs in higher order motor areas that are part of the frontal lobe. So they're just rostral to area 4. So a motor movement is planned based on a lot of things. You can anticipate that these areas are going to get a lot of input from higher order sensory areas and from multimodal areas. Remember, You want to make a movement, you're getting all the sensory input. If I walk backwards, I'm looking at my visual space. I'm getting information from my proprioceptors. There's a lot of sensory information that would be involved in my brain deciding what movement should I make next. And so widespread areas project to these areas that plan a motor movement. Now let's talk in a little bit more detail about how movement of a specific part of the body takes place. And again, here we restrict it to below the neck. Just like there are other maps in the brain, there's a map of the body onto motor cortex. And I don't think that's really surprising. We actually use this as an example of the anterior cerebral artery stroke that involved the leg. So here I am again. And you see that there's an orderly point-to-point representation of the body on the motor cortex, with the leg or the lower limb represented medially, and on the lateral surface of the cortex, the face and the upper limb. Now, the motor cortex contains an orderly representation of the contralateral body surface. And just like in sensory systems, there's a disproportionate representation of certain parts of the body. So as we look here in motor cortex, you see that there's a disproportionate representation for the area of the mouth and also of the fingers. And this relates to the very fine motor movement, which is necessary for speech, and the very fine motor movement that's necessary for dexterity of the fingers. So you see, again, a disproportionate representation based on what's important. So the map is similar, but not identical to the map you saw in somatosensory cortex. Now think about this. Motor cortex lies here, and then next to it, in front or behind the central sulcus of Rolando, you have the sensory areas 3, 1, and 2, primary somatosensory cortex. And it should make sense that these areas are complexly interconnected. When I want to make a motor movement of a particular type, like touching this part of the podium, I'm also getting feedback from the sensory system about this movement. Notice my joints are moving, I'm making movement, I'm touching this, I'm getting all kinds of feedback to my sensory cortex. That is interconnected with the motor cortex that then decides what the next movement is. So motor cortex has to sort of get the sensory information before these neurons are going to fire to know what next movement should be planned and executed or initiated. So there's a lot of connections between them, and a lot of important information is transmitted in these individual pathways. So each half of the motor cortex is going to control the movement of the contralateral one half of the body. The axons of motor cortex make up that cortical spinal tract, and that cortical spinal tract is going to course down through the brainstem, down through this area of the brain, down in the brainstem, and in the lower medulla, those axons are going to cross and then enter the spinal cord. Now, the axons from different areas of motor cortex that control the movement of different parts of our body are going to exit into the spinal cord at different levels. So they want to exit at the appropriate level. So it wouldn't make any sense to have your body map, for example, for innervation of your upper limb. The axons that come from the part of motor cortex that controls your upper limb, you want those axons to exit at cervical levels of the spinal cord to allow your upper limbs to move, because they have to exit to synapse onto the anterior horn cells. On the other hand, if you want to make movement of your legs, then the cortical spinal tract axons have to go all the way down to lumbar regions of the spinal cord. So the areas of motor cortex in the medial surface, here in the medial surface, that control the movement of the leg, those neurons send their axons all the way down to lumbar regions of the spinal cord before they exit into the spinal cord itself. So if we look at the anterior horn cells are the cells in the spinal cord, and remember, they are the only cells which send their axons to the muscle. So if we looked at the spinal cord, here's what we see. This is actually a lumbar region of the spinal cord. So the lumbar region of the spinal cord is only going to have the axons. Now, first I should orient you. This is just a section taken through the cord. This is dorsal, which would be back, and this is ventral. And we're just looking down at it. So you see two halves of the spinal cord, just like you have two halves of the hemispheres. The cortical spinal tract actually runs right here. This is a Weigert-Stein section, so these are the axons of the cortical spinal tract that are darker. So the only axons at this level would be those that are for innervation of the lower limb, because all of the other axons have already exited at higher levels. So here in what we call the lumbosacral enlargement, which is the part of the spinal cord which is going to have anterior horn cells right here that go out to the muscle, these axons will now leave the pathway where they've been coursing in the spinal cord, and they will send axon terminals in here to synapse onto neurons in this area, and those cells go out. Now, this is such an important point. It is so important to understand this. I want to go back to this map image of the brain. This means, on our last slide, neurons whose cell bodies are located in this area of the cortex and are involved in making the initiation of the movement of the contralateral lower limb. Those axons will course all the way down in the spinal cord in that pathway and not exit until the lower levels of the lumbar spinal cord. And so that's how the appropriate muscle is contracted, because the motor cortex sends the axons down to the spinal cord in that way. And only the anterior horn cells project out to the muscle. This is referred to as the direct cortical spinal pathway. And the reason for that is obvious. Here's your neurons in some area of motor cortex, and these axons project directly to the spinal cord. So we call it the direct corticospinal tract. Now, we also have indirect cortical spinal pathways. Surely you didn't believe, after sitting through this course for a while, that it would really be so simple that there's only one pathway. So there's a lot more. There are indirect cortical spinal pathways. And indirect cortical spinal pathways, the best way to understand this is to think of a pathway where the motor cortex projects to some nucleus somewhere in the brainstem, and then that nucleus projects to anterior horn cells. So it's called an indirect corticospinal pathway. So motor cortex to the nucleus, and then that nucleus down to the spinal cord. So what do these pathways do? Well, these pathways are involved in something else, and if they don't work properly, we couldn't even make a motor movement. These indirect pathways, if I had to make a generalization about their function, by the way, there's many of them, but their overall function is to maintain the appropriate level of background tone, particularly in anti-gravity muscles of the body, like your quads. And so we walk upright. We couldn't do anything like step backward or dance or move our body in any way if we didn't have the appropriate background tone in the muscle against which movement is initiated. So you have to have that background tone in order to make an appropriate movement. And that is what these indirect cortical spinal tract fibers do. Now, the other thing that's important to understand about the direct cortical spinal and the indirect cortical spinal is that they both course together in the brain. So these indirect cortical spinal and the direct course together. And that's going to be important when we come back to clinical issues, because mostly these two pathways are injured together. You don't have one injured and then the others. They're injured together. And that's what results in the signs and symptoms we see in patients. Now, there's also an extrapyramidal motor system. And this term came from the fact that early neuroanatomists knew there was a pyramidal system, that's your cortical spinal system, and then they saw that there were also other nuclei in areas of the brain that help control movement. So they decided they'd just call it extrapyramidal. So the term just means outside of the pyramidal system. It's kind of an old term because it's not really very accurate, but that's okay. Now, this extrapyramidal system is made up of a huge number of individual nuclei that play a role in motor programs. So what do I mean by that? I'll give one example. There are hundreds of motor programs taking place at any given time. In fact, when I turn and talk to you and I move my hands like this is almost like a habitual movement with me. It's part of a motor program that gets set off when I talk to people about the brain or I try to describe something. The better example for anyone to think about is that as we walk, we swing our arms at our side. We don't think about it. It's not an intentional movement that we think about. It's a motor program that gets set in as you shift your center of gravity from one leg to the other as you move. So motor programs are controlled by these extrapyramidal motor nuclei, and there's a lot of them, and they're found in lots of areas of the brain. So we're just going to look at a few of them. There are many more, but we're going to look at a few. There are some of the nuclei located in the telencephalon. Remember, the most recently evolved area of the brain. These are called basal ganglia. Now, this is really confusing. What on earth is a basal ganglia? Well, in the central nervous system, we call collections of neurons nuclei. But it turned out that early neuroanatomists saw that there were collections of nuclei in animals that controlled a lot of motor behavior, and they thought they were primitive, so they called them ganglia, because in the peripheral nervous system, collections of neurons are called ganglia. So this is an old terminology, again, that just hung on from the old days, but they're called basal ganglia. Now, another nucleus is found in the diencephalon, beneath the thalamus, and it's called the subthalamic nucleus. I'm going to show them to you in a minute. And the last one, which is going to be important when we talk about Parkinson's disease, is the substantia nigra. And we're going to see that it plays a critical role in Parkinson's disease. So let's look at where some of these nuclei are located. So this is a horizontal section through the brain. So it's taken in this plane. It's taken across like this. So this is rostral in the brain. Up here, this is the corpus callosum right here. This is rostral, and this is caudal. This is our cerebellum. So this is caudal. Up here in rostral areas of the brain, there are three major nuclei that are part of the basal ganglia system, telencephalic. You have your caudate, and I want you to notice that it's right here. This is the ventricle of the brain. So here's one of the ventricles. Here's another one, the holes in the brain. You have your caudate nucleus right here, pale staining nucleus. This is Weigert stain, so the nuclei show up light. And then you have another structure here that's actually consists of two nuclei, the putamen and the globus pallidus. I'm not as interested in you remembering the names of these structures, but just pointing out a few of them so you see where they're located. Now, this little guy right here is the subthalamic nucleus. So the thalamus is right about at this level, and this is beneath it, so this is really too low to see the thalamus, but here is your subthalamic nucleus. And the last nucleus, which is important in this extrapyramidal motor system, is going to be the substantia nigra. And this is a section through the midbrain. Remember, here's our midbrain, and because it's rostral midbrain, you also see caudal diencephalon here. So if you look at here, here was our lateral geniculate and our medial geniculate in the thalamus, but the rest of this is all midbrain. And the substantia nigra is a major structure in the midbrain, and it's the structure that's going to be very important again in Parkinson's disease. Now, if I show you on a real brain, and remember these plastic embedded sections are real pieces of human brain that have been embedded in plastic. This is the front of the brain. This is the back of the brain. So this again is a horizontal section. If we look here very closely, this area right here in the fresh brain with no staining at all shows up black. and it shows up black, and that structure is the substantia nigra. And that's why early neuroanatomists named it the black substance. Now, I said that this system was involved in subconscious motor programs, and that's really true. But this really hardly does justice to a system that has many more nuclei than this that are really complexly interconnected. So we're trying to simplify things so that we can understand what's going on, but be assured that they are very, very, very complicated. Now, a major difference between the pyramidal system, cortical spinal, and the extrapyramidal system, major difference, is that the extrapyramidal motor system has no projection to the spinal cord. All these complexly interconnected nuclei, only a few of which we've been talking about, have no projections to the spinal cord. So how are they going to change movement or make movement happen? Well, it turns out they do this by very complicated feedback circuits, feed forward and feedback circuits that are going to ultimately influence the direct cortical spinal or the indirect cortical spinal pathways. So they do it indirectly, not directly. So it's very important to appreciate this. One of their major projections of nuclei in this extrapyramidal motor system is going to be to motor nuclei in the thalamus. Now, we've concentrated on sensory nuclei to the thalamus, but there are also motor nuclei in the thalamus. So this system has complicated pathways that will go to the motor areas of the thalamus and then go up to area 4 and then alter what the cortical spinal tract does, both the indirect and the direct cortical spinal pathways. So think about this as you're making any movement, that you have these complicated feed forward and feedback circuits that are involved, that involve nuclei that are then going to alter the pathway that initiates a movement. This is very, very complicated. So how do nuclei of the extrapyramidal motor system know what movement the motor cortex wants to initiate? I'm going to reach over and I'm just going to touch area 4. I'm going to go do that. I'm going to do that just like this. Well, how does my extrapyramidal motor system know that I want to do that? And by the way, there are motor programs that are set in here too. Notice as I make the movement that the gross movement comes first, and then there's a fine movement as I go to touch something. These are like habitual ways of moving, and we have to have these extrapyramidal nuclei involved, otherwise you can't make a normal movement. So how does my extrapyramidal motor system know what my motor cortex wants to do? So here we have our motor cortex neuron, and it's sending its axon down to the spinal cord. That's what we mean by cortical spinal. But now looky here. At these nodes or breaks in the myelin sheath, this axon is going to send axon collaterals to the basal ganglia nuclei. And so when this initiates a movement, this is a single neuron. Remember, there's thousands of them. This neuron is going to send an axon, which is going to communicate with the basal ganglia and tell the basal ganglia what movement it's going to initiate. And you also see that other axons are going to eventually reach the cerebellum, which is the third part of the motor system. Now, I want you to think about this. As these nuclei are projecting down like this, each firing of that axon is sending the information to hundreds of areas of the brain, so that those areas of the brain are being informed about what one motor movement is going to be initiated. This is a very, very complicated thing that's happening. And if you think about this, this is the main way. We call a pathway by the one axon, which is the major part of it. So we call this corticospinal because that's the major pathway. But there are hundreds of axon collaterals peeling off at every point, connecting other areas of the brain. So other areas of the brain always know what the motor cortex is going to do and initiate. And this is in general how all the pathways in the brain are organized. the retina may project to the lateral geniculate in the sensory system for vision, but on its way to the geniculate, it has hundreds of axon collaterals peeling off to tell other areas of the brain what retinal ganglion cells have just been stimulated. And so this adds a level of complexity that I really want you to appreciate. So I want you to imagine at any given time, and we've only covered two of the systems, at any given time you make a movement, the simplest movement involves hundreds of pathways. And we just simplify it by calling them one pathway or two pathways, something like that. But there's actually all these axon collaterals, so there's actually much more information being transmitted. Now, let's review this. Sensory information comes into the brain. And these sensory areas are going to go to higher order sensory areas, that information. Then that information is going to be transmitted to areas that are rostral to area 4 for the planning of a movement. So if you're going to make a movement based on what you're seeing, or that you decide you want to make a movement, these rostral areas are going to plan it, and then they're going to project their axons to area 4. And area 4 is going to initiate the movement. And on the way down to the spinal cord, at the nodes, breaks in that myelin sheath, that main axon is going to send the information about what it's doing or what it intends to move to other nuclei so it knows what's going on. You also have indirect cortical spinal pathways that are maintaining appropriate background tone, particularly in anti-gravity muscles. And that's because I wouldn't be able to reach out and touch this podium if I didn't have a certain amount of muscle tone in the muscle itself. And so these indirect pathways are going to control that, and they course together in the brain. If you lose these pathways, the direct and indirect cortical spinal pathways, then you're unable to make a movement. You're paralyzed. Then you have an extrapyramidal system, which is very important, because it's going to play a role in these motor programs and lots of other things. Now, when you try to think about what it's doing, you remember two things. One, there's constantly going to be interconnections between these nuclei. And they're not going to project to the spinal cord. They're going to try to influence the direct and indirect cortical spinal pathways. And they're the only ones that actually will project to the spinal cord. And so there's these complicated feedback loops that are important. When we think about clinical disorders of these extrapyramidal systems or these extrapyramidal nuclei, it gets very complicated because there's a lot of them and they're interconnected. But let me just give you an idea of how devastating a disorder that can occur if you have one nucleus removed from this complicated circuit. That subthalamic nucleus I showed you, which is a small nucleus beneath the thalamus. If you have a unilateral lesion of that nucleus on one side, and this most commonly occurs from strokes, you end up with a disease which is a terrible disease called hemiballismus. And this means that you have flinging ballistic movements of your limbs. And these individuals end up dying because they constantly break their arms. They can't walk down a hallway without their limbs flinging out, involuntary motor movements from a lesion in a single nucleus in this complicated circuit. So everything about movement is thrown off because all of these things are complexly interconnected. The person can no longer control it. Another disorder up in the telencephalic nuclei, that caudate and putamen, those nuclei that are part of the basal ganglia system. There's a genetic disorder called Huntington's chorea. And at one time in the United States, every single case of Huntington's chorea could be traced to two brothers who came from England. It's a genetic disorder, a dominantly transmitted disorder, and people don't normally show any signs and symptoms till they're about 40 years old, which means they've generally already had children. And what happens in Huntington's chorea is the caudate and putamen lose a single type of neuron. Now we're down to the neuron level. one single type of neuron is lost in the caudate and putamen, and these individuals start having abnormal writhing movements of their body which they cannot control. They aren't able to sleep, they aren't able to do anything because of these movements. And the disorder results ultimately in death because of this. And so you see that you can remove a single type of neuron in one or more of these nuclei and have devastating disorders. So what we would like to do in the next lecture is to look at this third system, the cerebellum, which is involved in the coordination of motor movement, and see how it plays a role in allowing us to make these fine motor movements that human beings are capable of. Thank you.